Welcome to Gardening in the Mountains, Managing Water in Your Garden. James Wade, our speaker today, has a long history working with farms and gardens and their issues with water. He grew up on a small, unirrigated cotton and grain farm in dry western Texas. Every crop year brought a new challenge as drought and flooding alternated, and farm survival depended on understanding weather patterns and appropriate land preparation. Later, he worked with farmers and irrigated farms for the College of Agriculture at the University of Arizona. Water use and management is crucial to every aspect of life in the southwestern deserts. In his personal life, James has grown vegetables and maintained a landscape in a dried Tucson. His passion for land and water resources has not subsided in his retirement. In his Buncombe County home garden and landscape, James utilizes water management techniques and technologies appropriate to our dry and wet seasons, including drip irrigation, land shaping, drainage modification, and a rain garden. Let's welcome Extension Master Gardener Volunteer James Wade and learn more about water management. Take it away, James.
Thank you, Allison. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today and to present this discussion of managing water in your garden. I can't start today without acknowledging that we've had a very unusual week. The rainfall here in Western North Carolina was intense and substantial, causing a great deal of damage. This is kind of a change from the idea that this talk was originally scheduled around. August is sometimes a hot and dry month and doesn't have a lot of rainfall. And this year is an exception. So we're going to be talking about managing water in the dry sense, but this month has been very unusual. This year has been a bit unusual. For example, this is a picture of the rainfall at my house on Tuesday. I got about 7.5 inches of rain in a very short period of time. The red line shows the accumulated rainfall during the hours. Bottom line is 5-minute intervals. And you can see here that we had uh, rainfall intensity in the neighborhood of 5 inches per hour for a few minutes, causing some of the extremes that we saw in the weather patterns and the flooding that occurred. Western Buncombe County, which received an intense amount of rainfall, and a great deal of people had a lot of damage. Acknowledging that, we're going to be talking a bit more about dry circumstances. That's partly because this talk was scheduled a long time ago, and that's what we were thinking about. But we also know that it changes very quickly. And we can go from a very wet circumstance to a very dry circumstance in a quick order. So let's start. In a perfect world, rain would fall gently and as regularly as needed, and just before dawn, so as not to keep us indoors all day. Drought and irrigation systems would be unknown, and we in our gardens would all live happily ever after. That's a bit of an ideal, but that gives you kind of what we all would like to have, but it ain't so. Our objectives here are really to understand the limitations on water for gardening, some of the fundamentals of water use in the garden, and some techniques for the wise use of water. To do this, we're going to talk about three important components, primarily wastewater basics, water capture, and irrigation. Why be wise with water? Well, there's a lot of reasons. One of the reasons, of course, is drought. You really have no choice when you have a drought. You have to preserve the value of plants, or try to, and things can get out of hand pretty quickly. Another good reason is the cost of water, especially if you're on a city water system and you are paying substantial prices for water. And then for a broader perspective, water resources are limited. It's going to be in the future, I believe, a substantially difficult part of culture to utilize water in an effective and primary way. And then a third reason for water wise use is the idea of water leaving the property, especially with the slopes that we have here in Western North Carolina. We can get a lot of water leaving our properties, and these can have water quality issues. So if we can keep the water on our property, we reduce those water quality issues, and we can protect water wells if that's an interest. And then as is evident this week, you can manage stormwater to some extent by reducing the amount of water leaving property. So is this year, 2021, a wet year or a dry year? Well, I think we've answered that it's a wet year. But let's look at some of the statistics. This is from last week. The U.S. Drought Monitor shows that across the United States, the West, as we've been hearing on the news, is substantially burdened with drought and fires that are causing a great deal of problems. But in the East, we have very little issues with substantial moisture this year. We see a little bit of abnormally dry conditions in parts of North Carolina and Virginia, but overall, it's pretty good. If we look at the annual precipitation as recorded in Asheville, and I'm talking Asheville Airport here, we see a long-term trend that shows that the average rainfall per year is increasing over time. The variability is also increasing over time. We see that as of yesterday, we've had about 41.84 inches at the Asheville Airport. That's a lot, but compared to 3 years ago when we had 79 for the total year, that's not a whole lot. Now let's look at the variability across different times of the year. This teal black lined box is this current year and how that water is distributed over the time of the year. Some of you may remember back in April and May, we thought we were going into a drought year. It was really dry, and we could see those conditions playing out in our landscape. But now, after 3 months of above average rainfall, we see a different kind of circumstance. If we look at this graph, we'll see that in some years we have high rainfalls in different months. It's not extremely predictable. The main predictable aspect of it is that October and November are a bit drier than average, and maybe to some extent December and January. That is as expected because we get the rainfall from our storms that come in late summer and early fall. So if we look at the map of Western North Carolina, we see Asheville noted here on this map. You'll see that the light color is lower rainfall, and go to green to blue to purple is higher rainfall. I've heard it said that Asheville is the driest place east of the Mississippi River in terms of annual rainfall. And these blue areas down along the mountains are the highest rainfall. So Asheville itself, not the airport, Asheville itself averages about 40 inches a year. And down along the North Carolina-South Carolina border, it may average 90 to 100 inches per year. Let's look at that in this graph, which is kind of wonky. If you look at it, you'll see that the white area in the center up here is the Greater Asheville area, and we can see that it has almost a 40-inch rainfall average. But if you go down to where the airport is, you see it's about 50 inches or 48 to 50 inches a year at the airport, considerably south of us. So when you see a report on the news that says it's rained so much at the airport, the city of Asheville may be receiving considerably less. Many of us live in the surrounding areas, and we get a bit more rainfall as the mountains cup clouds and drain the water out around the mountains, and the valley doesn't get quite so terribly much. So a lot of the issues around rainfall and water availability are very local, and what I would call microsites. I'm pointing out here basically the place where I live. I live in Biltmore Lake, out close to Inca, Candler, where we got this tremendous rainfall last week. But if you look, my landscape site is circled on the map on the right. We're in the north edge of Scott Mountain. The mountain itself creates a barrier and creates an individual kind of rainfall, water situation and circumstance. Each place might be considerably different. If you went to the south side of Scott Mountain, you would probably have a higher rainfall. If you go to the west side of the lake, you have a lower rainfall. All of these are sort of local conditions that make managing water in a home site or home landscape an individual thing to be considered. Let's look a little bit of a definition of what is a drought. Well, drought's a period of especially prolonged damage to crops and landscape and other things brought about by lack of water. It's prolonged. It takes a time for it to occur. Sometimes it seems like we can go 2 weeks and we feel like we're in a drought, but the reality is droughts are long term. Just to make sure we're clear on a lot of it, that a garden is a human intervention in natural systems. So water challenged areas can be created by the way we go about our landscaping and our gardening. What are some of the signs of drought? Well, there are a lot of interesting ones. These particular ones I'm pointing out came from a publication by the Home and Garden Information Center at the University of Maryland Extension. One, upwardly curling leaves or rolling leaves. Another is yellowing and browning leaves, particularly along the margins. Signs of stress might be undersized fruit, vegetables, nuts. These garlic pods, you can see quite a bit of difference in them. And a lot of this is created by not just by local rainfall, but just absence of water. So drought stress would best be defined as the absence of sufficient water for the plants to perform as they need to. Another sign might be undersized leaves, limiting growth, blossom, and fruit drop is a important part of drought stress. Interior needles and leaf drop on conifers and evergreens are part of the drought stress we may see. Now, sometimes these symptoms are also related to other things, so you have to look at your circumstances and understand where you are. Sometimes they're caused by insects or disease or other things. Another significant statement is certain of the drought stress indicators, particularly on certain kinds of annuals, vegetables, etc., are also signs of overwatering. So we're likely to see some of these symptoms showing up in the next few weeks because of the amount of water that we've received, particularly disease and insect pressures. Another sign is the chlorosis of the leaf foliage, yellowing of veins. Some secondary problems might be an infestation of spider mites, blossom end rot on tomatoes, peppers, squash, and melons. That's a particularly difficult one here because people think that it's related to something else, but it's usually underwatering. Increased wildlife feeding on your fruits and vegetables, increased damage by insects and grasshoppers, driven into the landscape by lack of water. The secondary problems may be the ones we see first rather than the primary ones. The long-term consequences of drought are increased susceptibility to attack by insects, increased susceptibility to plant disease, root death, diminished winter hardiness, some terminal dieback twigs, and eventually plant death. So what are you going to do? If you're in a substantial drought circumstance, you got to prioritize because you can't use water on absolutely everything, particularly if you're paying high prices for it. So what are your priorities? Well, typically it might be that the shrubs are a high priority. Then your perennials and fruit trees and nuts might be a secondary priority. Lowest priority would be annuals and herb plants and ornamental grasses, established turf. Now, priority becomes sort of a personal thing, but knowing the cost of these items, the trees cost more than the annual flowers and take longer to grow, etc., you can see a certain logic in this prioritization for water use if you're having drought circumstances. There's some cultural tips that help you mitigate some of these drought circumstances. And we're going to talk about some of these in a little more detail as we go further into the conversation. You can mulch, avoid fertilizer, pesticides, keep foot traffic to a minimum, keep turf at least 2 feet away from young trees, control the weeds. It's interesting in dry circumstances, weeds are the ones that survive the best. They are, in fact, adapted to drier circumstances in many cases, so they can survive in very difficult circumstances. All right, I'm going to stop again just for a second and say, Allison, are we still clear of questions?
Well, James, would you mind elaborating a little bit more about why it would be helpful not to apply pesticides and fertilizers during times of drought?
Well, I think the one thing that is true is that they're less effective. If you apply them to try to kill weeds, you're simply not going to get the uptake of the herbicide, or if you apply a fertilizer, the plant is not going to take up the fertilizer as well. And so you get a lot more runoff of both of those types of chemicals, pesticides and fertilizers, when it does rain. When you are not having an uptake of those chemicals in your landscape from your plants in a dry circumstance, it will create problems. They have a half-life. They won't be there too terribly long, but if you get a good rain, you may come off very substantially. But I think the primary reason is they're just not as effective.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. One question: why should you avoid temptation to prune dead wood? Why would you not want to prune dead wood?
Well, I think, again, if it's totally dead, maybe not too big of an issue, but if you are trying to deadhead something, you're simply adding additional stress to the plants.
Great. Thank you, James.
All right, let's proceed. The question is, what is wise water use? It doesn't mean eliminating irrigation from the garden. It does mean designing and maintaining a landscape for effective water use, reducing the need for water from irrigation, become less vulnerable to drought, water shortages, that is, reducing the risk of your landscape, and the use of ecologically sound practices to create high quality gardens. Reduce the runoff from your property. That may be the controversial one relative to the question of too much water, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. The idea is being knowledgeable and considerate whenever you're thinking about water use. Again, remembering that it is a costly and environmentally sensitive resource. We're going to talk about some components of water-wise landscape. I think the handout that I sent out had 6 components of water-wise. They are all included in this 8 components that others include. A lot of this concept of water-wise landscape was created in areas that have a tendency toward long-term lack of water. So they would be the deserts of the West, California, Colorado, Arizona, of course, and other places like that. Part of this is an attempt to look at water in a holistic way, and then to use that way to reduce the amount of purchased water or a precious amount of water that you might have. So you can see this list here. We're going to go through each of these, some of them quickly, and we will try to provide as much detail as we can. Let's understand that you're going to get this slide set, and this is being recorded, so it'll be available to you, and you can see the details of some of these things. So let's start with planning and design. One of the things you need to understand is what your space looks like. This happens to be my landscape. You see the graph on the left, which comes from the county database. The elevations are marked off here in, I think, 10-foot intervals. Maybe it's less than 10 feet, but there are different kinds of slopes that are available. And you can see that I have a slope that goes from one corner to the other and down. That doesn't consider the house, but that is the sort of general landscape slope. My slope is typically from the left side to the right side of that picture, about 8%. The house landscape, of course, is also a part of that. You can see we've got asphalt driveway, we've got a house, it's been modified some. I've got a sunroom on the back. I've got patios and decks that have been added, but those all provide permeable and impermeable spaces that can absorb or repel water in various ways. If we look at the design, we needed to look at a site map, a more specific one. This one is just an example one, but you've got to look at it and understand the kinds of information that will help you in managing the water on your space. So you need to know where the sun and the shade is, where the runoff is, the slope, the type of soil, the amount of compaction, and water use zones. And by this, I mean grouping plants in a situation where there is consistent water use. If you put a high water use plant right next to a low water use plant, you're going to have difficulties getting water to be effective. You may put too much on one and too little on the other, and those kind of groupings become important. One of the things I like to point out on this map that doesn't show up quite as well is that some of their dead zones in terms of dryness are under the eaves of your house. So the 3 or 4 feet adjacent to your house can be extremely dry and hard and compacted. You want it to be compacted because you want the water to run away from your house, but at the same time, if you're trying to plant close to your foundation, you'll find that the ground is often very dry and does not handle certain kinds of plants very well. Same thing has to do with shade. You get hotter and cooler areas depending on the structures and where those structures are, and the amount of water needed in those areas is different depending, again, on how much you're getting on the rainfall and how much you're having to apply by other means. So when you're starting to plan a landscape, you need to take into account all of those things. I would say that a lot of that is trial and error. Learn, learn, learn. I have found that I have areas that are much wetter than I expected them to be, and I have areas much drier than I expected to, more shade in some places and less shade in others, all of which create interesting problems. Another piece we'll talk about later on a bit is the idea of drainage. By that, I mean gutters and drain pipes that may go out from your property. For example, on my property, I found that I had 6 pop-up drains at the street. So all the water that was coming off the house into gutters was being channeled to the street. Not good in an environmental sense. The next item is to improve the soils. This one can be a little bit controversial, but what you need to do is to get more organic matter into most of our soils because most of our soils are heavy clays. But on the other hand, in many uses, like planting trees and shrubs, you should use mostly native soils, very little amendments, because those amendments will tend to create a bit of a planter box for those plants. You need the roots to go out further to get more moisture in further areas. Also, you probably want to try to apply some of those amendments just on the surface and not to till. Soil is typically mineral, air, water, organic matter. Organic matter is typically about 5% in ideal soil. If we looked at the texture of soil, we would say that there's sort of three components: clay, silt, and sand. We're up in that red zone somewhere with the clay and clay loam, some silty clay. The yellow dot represents an ideal soil, and that exists in very few places. I went to Iowa State University. Around Iowa, there's some pretty good soil that would fit into those categories, but not a lot of other places have that good of soil. Soil textures vary within your landscape. That's particularly true in new properties where the soil has been compacted by the construction process itself. So what do you do to improve the soil? Well, maybe you add some things. When you look at the water retention capacity, I'm going to emphasize the clay down at the bottom of this table. But clay soils have low permeability, meaning that the water doesn't really go into the clay very far, very fast, but it has high retention, meaning it also is withdrawn fairly slowly. As we probably all realize, sand has very high permeability, but a low water retention rate. And then, of course, in the middle, the loam and silt are better. Can you add organic matter? Well, yes, it gives more room for water to be held in the soil. But again, creating the perfect soil is an elusive goal that we all would like. So summarizing the soil kinds of things, you need to do a soil test to see what kind of things you need to add. You typically want to add organic material only till where it's absolutely necessary. Putting it on the surface works very well, maybe a bit slower, but it works very well. I've come to the conclusion that I will use primarily wood chips and apply them directly to the surface and no longer try to dig amendments into the soil. Avoid compaction. Photograph on the right is a photograph of a place where a house is being built in this neighborhood. And you can see the kinds of soil that are there. You can see the kind of compaction that some of the equipment are placing on the soil. You need to increase the water holding capacity in some way, and adding organic matter is one way to do that. But also, if you dig it up, you dig up weeds, you create other problems. So placing it on the surface works well. Need to select appropriate plants. Consider your microsites. Good plants are often tolerant of different urban and suburban water sunnits, but you've got to find the right ones. Healthy plants need less water. Growth rates are important. And recognize, of course, that native plants have an advantage. They seem to adapt better to low water use and to the particular conditions that exist around the neighborhood. I'm going to give some examples here of some plants that are advantageous to water. I guess we'd call them drought tolerant plants, things that you will see in the landscape that are not affected as quickly as others by low water availability. Again, we're trying to talk about the idea of putting plants in that don't have to have a lot of water. If you get huge rains, some of these plants may be susceptible to other things, but in general, these are native plants and they will adapt fairly quickly. Don't try to write these down. You'll get this slide set and get from there. So I'm going to go quickly through them. That's some annuals, biennials, and perennial plants. Here are a few more of the same kinds of plants that are in place. The photograph is shown by the red arrow what the plant is. Some of the things we're beginning to see this time of the year are like the goldenrods, the verbena. These things, again, are pretty good at adapting to low water conditions. The yucca down there, the yucca is, of course, always thought of as a southwestern plant, a desert plant, but it grows very prolifically in the mountains and low water circumstances. Grasses, these are some of the native grasses and others that will do well in low water use conditions. I have to say, though, that these grasses need to be pretty much in good sunlight. I have some switchgrass that doesn't seem to grow real well because it's in too much shade. So again, you got to select not only for drought tolerance, but also for shade tolerance. And there's some shrubs, again, a list that you'll be able to see more completely later, and a series of trees that work well in the landscape and adapt well to a lesser rainfall circumstance. The fourth item on our list is the idea of practical turf areas. This idea is shrink the lawn, select appropriate varieties of turf grass, maintain the grass, aerify it, that is, aerate it to give additional infiltration, mow at a proper height. Again, shade will affect this very much, but one of the big issues, I think, environmentally across the country is the abundance of turf grass. There's far too much of it. So the idea is to shrink it. You can see this little patch of turf. This was when our house was first built. The contractor put it in. This is too shady. It didn't do well. But you can see how much ground is not in turf. So we've tried to maintain that and keep the turf grass and reduce the turf grass to a minimum. Mulch. Mulch trees and others, but do it properly. Maintain from the trees, use the right kind of materials. Don't use synthetic materials. Don't use dyed materials. Use natural items. Again, in this application nowadays, I use primarily arborist wood chips, but occasionally I will use ground wood bark mulch like most other people would do. Maintain, weed as appropriate. Try to keep the weeds down. Remember that the weeds are the ones that do best in the low water circumstances. And again, avoid excess fertilizer. Use the right kinds of fertilizer. Applied spring, avoid the summer. Mow at the proper height, 3 to 4 inches. Maintain your irrigation system if you have one. Irrigation, irrigate and water efficiently. Established plants need about an inch of water a week, including rainfall. May require more in some specific areas or certain zones around your house. But the idea here is going back to the quote at the beginning. If you got an inch of water a week, that would be about 52 inches a year. And you'd probably be fine and nobody would ever need to irrigate or have any kind of extra watering. But the reality is that's not the way it occurs. It occurs in big gushes at various times. What's wrong with this picture? Well, when I give this talk in person, I wait to hear the answer. But the answer is something like this. This person is probably watering at the top of the plants. Plants absorb water from their roots, not from their leaves. That is, most of them do. And so it doesn't do plants a whole lot of good to spray across the top of the plants. They need water at the surface and into the surface, into the soil, so that the plants can consume the water. There's different types of irrigation that can get you there. We see soaker hoses and drip lines and sprinklers and spot watering. And we should also use timers. This sprinkler is like a turf grass. Typically, it's to sprinkle it because it's very hard to use all the other kinds of things in it. But again, if you're reducing the total amount of turf grass available that you're using, you want to have as many sprinklers. And you have to be careful about getting turf grass, and I'll show you some reasons coming up. Soaker hoses work well. They put the water at the roots. It keeps it off the stems, keeps the stems dry. We avoid a certain amount of disease. They're easily adjustable, and they're relatively inexpensive. There's different kinds of garden sprinklers. Again, I use them occasionally, but it's not something that is recommended in every circumstance. Sprinklers may be more effective on slopes. If you have a high slope, you may find that sprinklers are a better irrigation system. Drip irrigation puts the water where it does the most good. Again, it's not necessarily appropriate for turf, but it works great for most annuals and perennials that are in place if you need them to be protected. I have used it around the foundation plants. I also use it in my vegetable gardens. It keeps water from the plant structures and controls the amount very much. So you may only be putting a gallon or two or three times a week on a particular plant. And drip irrigation systems can be installed by a home gardener without too terribly much difficulty. Irrigation controllers are part of the drip systems, but they're also a part of others. There are lots of different kinds, and you should probably try to find some that will meet your needs. They can be very expensive or they can be very inexpensive. They're getting to be more inexpensive, and nowadays they are hooked up to your smartphone and your Bluetooth and your internet and you can control them from wherever you want. I haven't tried that yet, but I find it sort of intriguing in one sense of the word. Of course, on the other hand, my internet goes out often enough that it's kind of a problem. This is one of my favorite graphs. And the reason is because most people in the mountains assume that the dead looking grass in this time of the year in the summer is because of the lack of water. So you see irrigation systems put a lot of water on grasses to try to green them up. It's just the natural tendency of cool season grasses to be less vigorous during the summer. Most of the turf grass in the western mountains is cool season grass, bluegrass, and fescue. Most of the warm season grasses are things like Bermuda and Tiff, soya, and they grow vigorously in the summer, but they're pretty much totally dormant in the winter. Whereas the cool season grasses grow vigorously in the spring and fall and are more dormant in the summer and winter. So if you're trying to water cool season grass in the summer, you're going to find that it is ineffective and your grass will be reasonably good shape come fall, whether you water it or whether you don't. If you are going to water lawns, water deep, use care when you're getting on a slope, use a timer, surge water for 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, and then repeat as needed. You need to reduce the runoff. Don't let it run into the streets, especially where you have slopes involved in that. Spot watering in small places, not the most effective use of time and water, but it's sometimes very much necessary. But water deep if you're going to spot water, and water at the root of the plant. It doesn't help to water the leaves and stems. So irrigation efficiency summary is like this. Group plants by water needs. Use soaker hose, drip irrigation at the roots. Water only when needed. Check soils, water deeply. Maintain the system. Water at dawn to minimize evaporation. Don't put your plants to bed with wet feet. Now we're going to talk a little bit about captured runoff if you have too much water, and we'll see if this answers some of the questions.
Before you go on really quickly, I think when you were talking about amending soils, you talked about using chips. There was a question about, is there a wood chip that's more preferable and why only chips?
Part of it has to do with the vertical size of the chips. Any arborist chips works pretty well. There's not a lot of literature on it. I think there's a couple of things in the reference set about it, but it's become a more popular item. They're typically can be free if you can catch the arborist in your neighborhood and have them dump them for you. We're using them in the demonstration garden out at the extension office. Part of that has to do with the fact that it stays in place longer. It effectively is the growth of mycorrhizae and, a kind of a soil enriching kind of environment. Whereas other kinds of mulch will tend to blow off or wash off or move, particularly on slopes, away from the areas that's there. Avoid putting any kind of landscape fabric or landscape material underneath your chips or your mulch. Again, this is an effective way to encourage mycorrhizae and biosystems development underneath the chips themselves.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. When we're capturing runoff, we're looking at the question of permeable and impermeable spaces. And sometimes you can do it in different ways, but what we're looking at is here's 4 different ways of thinking about it. Permeable surfaces, land shaping and bioswales, rain gardens, and rain barrels and cisterns. We'll look at each of those quickly, but as we look at them, we need to think about water flow and rate. Where is the water coming from? This is my house in 2013, I believe, when we had 5 inches or so. I get all this water and I suddenly realized it was coming from my neighbor's downspout. It had been just stubbed off, hit the property line, more or less. And when the lot that we built on was vacant. And so here was all this water coming down. The question is, what do? You go complain to your neighbor or do you try to figure out something to do? So what I tried to do was to change the flow rates that were coming out from his gutters by putting stones and other things and use the water in the woodlands between our 2 properties. Now I rarely, even in this rain this week, did not have this much water accumulating. So that's the idea. Looking at the adjacent properties as the source of runoff. Your house, your garage, your outbuildings are all impermeable surfaces that can be sources of large amounts of water coming off the property. Don't forget drives and driveways and walkways. Consider where the water is leaving your property now and after you might modify it. Permeable surfaces, driveways and walkways can now be built with stones that will absorb a certain amount of water. Patios and cool decks can do that as well. That's not always as effective. Some of those stones I've found in this neighborhood have sunk, perhaps that the underpinning wasn't properly prepared. In this case, there is sand underneath these stones and it will absorb a certain amount of water. Other kinds of permeable surfaces can be installed as well to try to absorb a certain amount of the water that's coming to the property. Landscaping and swales are important. Again, this is some of the runoff in my property, not a very good picture. But you can create bioswales, which are just large soil mounds, if you will, berms. Those berms will help move and shape water in a particular way. I see this as kind of a very passive way of handling water that might potentially leave your property. I had stated in the early part of my existence on this property that I didn't want any water to leave the property. Unfortunately, that's not a reality. The idea was to try to keep as much water on the property as you possibly could to utilize it in an effective way. Keep your plants from getting stressed. So when you have a small amount of rain, you can use that water in some way to affect the particular property. Here's a picture I took yesterday. This is a tree in our front yard. It is a chestnut oak. And because of the building and the construction, the compaction, this tree was in seriously bad health. It's a very large and old tree, and I thought we were going to lose it. You can see the downspout over here. This downspout was routed to the street. You can see how I've changed it so that the downspout is coming out from this little wall. I added the little wall last year and comes out and water just sort of flows into this area. A tree this size uses tens of thousands of gallons of water a year. And if your house and your driveway are blocking its root zone, then it's not going to get the water and it's going to die. So I diverted the water into the area that might have some of the root zone. And this tree is now doing very well, and I hope that it will be able to survive. I thought 2 years ago it was a goner and we were going to lose it. So that's one way of capturing water and utilizing it more effectively. I'm going to stop right here for a couple of questions. Allison?
Hey, somebody's asked if you have an after picture of how you handle runoff on your property.
Well, I guess that's what I consider this to be one of those ways I handled it. I'm going to talk about rain gardens here in a minute, and that's another way I did it. So I will show some before and after pictures of that in just a second.
Okay, great. Someone also asked about irrigating mature oaks. And I want to lead off to say that we have gotten a number of calls this summer about concerns around large mature oaks, mainly red oaks. They are deeply affected by long term drought stress. But the question specifically in the chat box is around recommendations for irrigating when and how.
Well, I guess I would only irrigate them when they're very young. I would make sure they're planted properly in a way that they will adapt to the native soil. I would say maybe the first year, maybe 2 years, you might irrigate them. And after that, I don't think irrigation on large oaks is necessary or appropriate. Allison, you might disagree with that. I don't know. But I think you've got to let them adapt to the area that they're in. You got to make sure that they're healthy to begin with, they grow well, and go from there.
I agree with you, James. And I think I'll put something in the chat box regarding what they're calling oak decline. And they're not being specific, but the recommendation is that it is related to changes in environmental conditions that lead to insect and disease infestations. They are avoiding damage, maintaining healthy plants, keeping the turf down around the trees, things that you've already recommended. So, yeah, a big topic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would say that if you've got, as I have, a mature forest, really large trees, you should not have to irrigate them. But on the other hand, you might find that some landscaping might put water in the root zone that might otherwise run off and create problems.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to move into rain gardens next, and we're going to talk a little bit about what rain gardens are. This is some of the early photographs from the early digging in my rain garden. Rain gardens are not ponds. They're not water gardens, they're not ponds. They need to drain within 2 to 3 days. And by that, I don't mean drain out of a lower spot, but drain into the soil. There's some really simple ones like mine, which I hand dug, or there's engineered ones like the one at the extension office that are quite large and needs a structural engineer to follow them and put them in place. The anatomy of a rain garden is a depression in the landscape. And then you've got to deal with soil within that depression and organic matter in that depression, certain kinds of plants and rocks. We see rocks in this photograph here at the right. We're going to talk about each of these quickly. Rain gardens are a situation where you've got sort of a site analysis. You need to look at the drainage. You need to place them not too close to the buildings or well. You need to size appropriate to the expected rainfall. Now, I'm going to comment right here. You couldn't build one big enough to handle the rainfall I got on Tuesday in about a 15-minute time period. You'd have to have it'd be big as your lot to handle that much rainfall. On the other hand, you can handle part of that, or you can handle smaller rainfalls. And one of the issues that we've been seeing, I think, is with this climate change and the more variability of rainfall, is that more of our rains are more intense, and they may be quite a bit of rainfall in a very short period of time. And then we may go for a long period of time without much rain. So you need to size it. You need to look at the preparation and plant selection. So the depression, it's a watershed. You have to analyze and look at how big the watershed is that you're dealing with. And you need to think about how big to make it. So a 1-inch rain on 1,000 square foot of impermeable surface, it will generate about 83.3 cubic feet of water. And you can store that in a 6-inch depression of 167 square feet. Now, that's if you just dug a hole that was 6 inches deep and 167 square foot, you could put all that water in it. But then you have the soil dependent and you want it to soak in. So in sandy soils, it would go down very quickly. So you could use a smaller area. And in clay soils, it goes down very slowly. So you need a larger area. Slope is important. If it's running into an area that's sloped, it'll all kind of run to one end, and you've got to understand how that's going to happen. And you may want to put an overflow in because, well, stuff happens and it does have to overflow. At the bottom right is a calculator for the building of a rain garden. So what the idea is that this depression is capturing the water from 1,000 square foot of roof. But most of us have much more than that. And certainly I did. The picture at the right are the plants in my rain garden from a couple of years ago. And there's some issues there, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we have time. So you got some problems. This happened to be right after I was starting digging and building, and I was thinking about size. And then suddenly we get a 3-inch rainfall in one afternoon, and it all went to naught because it spread over the side. You need to break up the soil. It needs to be permeable, and you need to make it more permeable if necessary. So you need to amend, filter, put wood chips in, put soil amendments in. Sometimes people put gravel and sand in. And this depression is to capture some of the water and, of course, make it a garden so you can select plants to go in it. If you're going to put organic matter in it, here's some options. The organic material can enhance plant growth, and it helps to increase the permeability and water retention of the areas. I suppose the preferred stuff is what we would call the fibers in the table to the right, with the exception of peat. I would probably use any of those. The reason I accept peat is because it's an environmentally concerning element, and it could be kind of costly to get here in the mountains. It's not always comes from an environmentally friendly source. Of course, putting compost and manure in is okay, works fine. These inorganic things, perlite and vermiculite, I again don't particularly like the idea of perlite because it's an environmentally difficult thing. Vermiculite is kind of a mineral, and it will also help increase the permeability and the water retention rates. But mostly what I have tended to use is the wood chips and the hardwood bark where I can get it. So I've dug a hole, I've broken up the soil, I've amended the soil, I add more organic matter to make it more permeable and help retain water. Now you want to select some plants. You need something that's tolerable of saturated soil for a short period of time and then thrives under dry conditions. Most natives will work. It needs to be sustainable and low maintenance. Here's a picture of a planting selection from a publication at Clemson's Home Garden Information Center called Rain Gardens. And this is one for full sun. And these are mostly native plants that can be put in place. And if you look at that publication, you'll see alternates for part sun and full shade and other kinds of things. Again, you want to keep this kind of environment away from a building, at least 10 feet away. And I would say you need to probably keep it away from large, mature trees as well. It could cause problems with too much water for the trees. Plant selection, well, not suitable. First thing on the list is trees. Heavy feeders like crepe myrtles and things like that. Stay away from things that don't like wet feet like azaleas. Plants susceptible to root rot like dogwood. And things with excessive root systems like willows. All right, rock. Why do you want rock? Well, rock is the idea that slow it down, spread it out, soak it in. So as the water hits the rocks, it will disperse, go into other areas that can absorb some water, and it also won't wash away. So using rocks to keep large amounts of water in a relatively close place could be put in place. The more rocks you have, the less space you have to put stuff. All right, this is the space that I started with in 2012. This is kind of how it looked in 2014. And at this stage, had not dug the hole out as well. You can see I've got some drainage spots there, and I've got some plants that I selected. Here's what it looked like in 2015. Again, changing. This is what it looks like today. It's overgrown a bit. It needs to be maintained over the winter. I'm going to have to take some of these plants down a bit and reduce their size and make them fit the space better. And here's another piece of how it looks today. I could take a couple of questions.
James, there was a question about the rain garden. You said not to put it near a well. Could you explain that?
You don't want to put it too close to structures or wells. And the reason, of course, is that you don't want to contaminate your well. Hopefully, the water will be going down into the water table beneath the rain garden. You could potentially move contaminants that are coming from your impermeable surfaces or fertilizers or other things into your wells and would contaminate the wells.
Okay, great. Thank you, James.
All right. Rain barrels, I'm not going to go into any depth here, but I will point out something. If this 1 inch of rain we talked about on 1,000 square feet would generate 623 gallons of water, and your rain barrel is usually 50 to 60 gallons. So I find rain barrels to be a relatively impractical solution, although they will hold water and one could use them in a dry situation, but you better provide an overflow valve because they will overflow almost any time. You can increase the capacity by chaining them or making them work in other fashions. If you're going to use water in a rain barrel, you need to have a pump to get the water out. Or you could use gravity flow if you've got it in the right place, but most people would need to have a pump. You can use a cistern, which to me is just a big rain barrel. It's much larger, but again, it takes a commercial installation. You probably want to bury them. You may need a pump. Those are important concerns. You got to maintain them. You got to keep mosquito screens on them, and you got to keep the algae out, and you not use them in the winter. Well, a summary of a winter-wise landscape is the plan, improve the soil, select appropriate plants, use practical turf areas, mulch, maintain appropriately, irrigate water efficiently, and capture the runoff. And all of this helps improve water quality as well as your pocketbook as you reduce the amount of water use in a dry stress situation. And that, my friends, is what I have. Any additional questions? I'll be happy to try to answer them.
We don't have any additional questions, James. Thank you so much. It was a very thorough program. Really appreciate you presenting for us today.
Thank you much, everyone.
I want to let you know that next Saturday on the 28th of August, we'll have square foot gardening. Our gardening in the mountains for September 16th is 4-season trees and shrubs for Western North Carolina. So have a great day, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.